Hello there. Well, today's story is from the Book of Kings in the Old Testament, and it's about a man called Naaman. Now, Naaman was the commander of the army under the king of Syria. Now, at this particular time, people didn't believe in God, they didn't know God. They just followed the kings. There was a succession of kings, some good, some not so good. So this is a story based in Syria. And Naaman, as I said, was the army commander, very well respected, mighty warrior, and the king had a lot of time for Naaman. Naaman, in turn, would have been quite wealthy and he would have been very popular. But the one problem that Naaman had was that he had an illness, a disease. He had leprosy. Now, leprosy was pretty awful because it was incurable. Not only was it incurable, it was actually very, very contagious. So this would have caused a problem for those people that loved and cared for Naaman, and it would have caused a problem for the king. So Naaman had everything except for health, good health. He had this leprosy. Now, also at this time, under Naaman's command, the king of Syria invaded Israel and fought the Israelites and captured many of them and took them back to Syria to be slaves. One of the slaves that Naaman captured was a young girl. Now, at this time, people were rebelling against God, but this girl, she knew God and she trusted God, and she knew that God had a plan for her life. So even though it was very difficult that she was captured as a slave and taken back to Syria away from her family and all her friends and everything that she'd known, she knew and trusted God and that some good would come of it. So this young girl that Naaman had captured and brought back to Syria as a slave served Naaman's wife and did everything for her. Now, I think that she must have sensed the sadness from Naaman's wife and she really wanted to help. And as I said, that she sensed God's call on her life and God's purpose. And so she chose to help. Now, ordinarily, you wouldn't think that that would happen. Here she is, a girl that's been taken away from her home, captured, used as a slave, and yet she's here and wanting to help and make the most of everything. And so she decided that she would speak to Naaman's wife, and she said to Naaman's wife, if only he would go and see a prophet in Samaria, one of God's people, a prophet, and he could be healed. The prophet that the girl thought could help was called Elisha, and so she really desperately wanted her master, Naaman, to be healed of the leprosy. So Naaman's wife spoke to Naaman, and they agreed that Naaman would speak to the king of Syria and ask his permission to go and see the prophet Elisha. So the king was pretty desperate to have his commander cured of leprosy, and so sent off Naaman with a letter to the king of Israel. And Naaman also took with him some gifts. He took 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of clothing. That would have been an incredible amount of gifts of extremely high value, probably over £1 million. And so when Naaman arrived in Israel, he took the letter from his king to the king of Israel. The king of Israel read the letter and was very disturbed because he knew that he didn't have the power to do anything to help Naaman. And also he didn't really know or didn't have a very good relationship with Elisha the prophet. So he had a problem. And this king wasn't a particularly good king either. He was called Jehoram, and he was evil, and he got rid of things that caused people to worship Baal, but he still worshipped other gods, and that is also a sin. But the king was so upset about this letter that he tore off his clothes, and someone saw that taking place and told Elisha. So when he heard about the king of Israel tearing off his clothes, and he heard about the letter, and he heard about Naaman, Elisha sent for Naaman and wanted him to know that there was still a prophet of God in Israel. So Naaman and his servants who travelled with him came to the place where Elisha was staying, and Elisha must have heard the commotion, looked out of his window and saw Naaman there. Now Elisha didn't go down and greet Naaman, But what Elisha did do is he sent a messenger. Elisha's messenger gave Naaman these instructions. He said, "Go and wash yourself 7 times in the river Jordan, and your flesh will be restored and will be cleansed." Now, Naaman looked at this messenger, and I think he was a little bit put out that Elisha hadn't bothered to come and see him himself, so he was pretty furious. He, in his own mind, had thought that this healing would be nothing like what the messenger was saying. He thought that Elisha would come to him and he would probably say some kind of prayer over him, and instantly he would be cleansed. Elisha didn't really, Naaman didn't really like the idea of going into the River Jordan because it was very muddy and horrid, and here was this messenger telling him to go into the river 7 times. Pretty disgusting, he thought. So he stomped off in a bit of a rage, and of course Naaman's servants, I think, who may have possibly included this young girl, I don't know for sure, they had a couple of choices. They could either just let Naaman carry on having a rant and a rage, or they could persuade him to listen to what the messenger said, or they could just keep their mouths shut. So anyway, they decided that they would help. They would encourage Naaman to follow the instructions given to him about washing in the River Jordan. So the servant said to Naaman, "My father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? Then why not do this small thing that he has told you to do?" And so, of course, the servants encouraged Elisha and Naaman to follow Elisha's instructions. And so Naaman, the great warrior who was used to being honoured and respected, was going to have to humble himself and do something that he really didn't fancy doing to help with his healing. He chose to humble himself and go down to the River Jordan, and he did exactly as he was told. He went down to the River Jordan 7 times. Into the mud and the horrid waters, and on the 7th time, as he came back up, he realised that his skin was healed and it was restored to the skin of a young boy. So Naaman went back to see Elisha and to thank him for all that he'd done. He wanted to give him the gifts that he'd brought, and he stood before Elisha and said, "Now I know there is no God in the entire world except Israel. Please accept now a gift from your servant." And Elisha really wanted Naaman to fully understand that it was God and only God that healed him, so he wouldn't take any of the gifts that Naaman was presenting to him. Naaman urged Elisha to take some of the gifts to show his gratitude, but Elisha still said no. He didn't want to be thanked for something that God had done, and he wanted Naaman to understand that it wasn't Elisha that had done the healing, it was God. So this was the time when Naaman actually learned that there was a true God who loved and cared for him. So Naaman's life was forever changed because of a young girl who used the opportunity that God gave her to speak out and share with her master all about God. This one young girl, who was just an ordinary young girl, had made a big difference in the world of Naaman and his family. And lots of us can make a difference in the lives of people that God puts in our lives by using every opportunity to please him. And there are lots of examples of people speaking out, people that you wouldn't expect to speak out, and using an opportunity to speak out for good. So we'll talk a bit more about those people, and we will think about how that young girl who trusted and loved God was able to share something of that love with somebody that didn't know God. How amazing is that? I'm so excited to see you on Sunday. Bye for now.